Shalom. This is Talk from the Heart, and I'm your host, Dr. Patricia Venegas. And back in studio today, I've invited Art and Mary Fernandez back to be with us again, that their story continues. As they came into the ministry, they were not living together. They had only been married 2 years. They couldn't even talk. They could only text because they argued about everything. And when they came into the ministry, I asked them, what's going on and what happened in your past? That as we found that we bring baggage into our marriage, that many things happen before we ever walk down that aisle to say, I do, that we have a history from even the time we're born of in our mother's womb, we could be rejected and abandoned, and it sets us on a tailspin throughout life. People passing away, as we heard with Mary's first husband, having children. How many people are a blended family today that either after divorce or after the death of a spouse, that we bring children into the relationship? And sometimes we bring children in when they never even had the other parent, that the other parent was not ever involved. We talked about the demonic, how sometimes there's spiritual warfare against a marriage, and many times we find that. We find rejection and abandonment, unforgiveness, word curses, passed down generational demons, witchcraft, as we found with Mary's grandmother-in-law from her first marriage. We spoke about so many things with them that really affect our marriage. And remember, marriage is symbolic of Christ in the church. And this is what's on the church today. That how do we love God with all of our heart, our mind, and our soul, and love others as ourself if we don't know who God is? As Art did not have a good representation of his heavenly father because of his earthly father was so abusive. Even though he was raised in a Christian home, he didn't know the love of God. How could he even respond back to God's love if he never even knew who God was or is? How can you surrender your life to somebody that you feel that's angry with you all the time, as Art's dad was with him? So we see that we need to love God with all of our heart, our mind, and our soul, but how do we do that? How do we do that if we really don't know the Elohim of Israel? And then how do we love others if we do not even know what love is? If we don't even love ourselves? If we have such a spirit of rejection and abandonment that puts walls around our heart to keep love from coming in and love from going out, it's very difficult if we don't have love, that we can't give love. I invited Art and Mary back in studio today because after we dealt with inner healing and deliverance for them and dealt with spiritual warfare and curses, we also had to go into their temperament and their love language, because it's so important for us to understand that we're born with a temperament, not temper, but a temperament. And there's 4 basic temperaments that we're a combination of. And when Art married Mary, their temperaments was clashing. And Satan is so clever at attacking us in our weakness, not our strengths. So our temperament taking too far becomes a weakness. There's 4 basic temperaments. They're called choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, and melancholy. The choleric is a strong-willed temperament, my way or the highway. They have a lot of tenacity to get things done, and they know what they're going to do and how to do it, and they're always right. And so they have no problems with confrontation. The next temperament is sanguine. The sanguine is really bubbly and happy and tells stories and loves children. And you might know this temperament if you've ever been at a restaurant or in a public place and someone comes in and they see somebody across the room and it's like, "Hi, Susie, hi. Oh my gosh, it's so good to see you." And they're loud and boisterous and they love to talk and they love to tell stories. They make great salespeople. The next temperament is phlegmatic. They're quiet. They want peace at any cost. They don't like confrontation. They really have a quiet, strong will. The last temperament is melancholy. Melancholy is analytical. They need a lot of information. They ask a lot of questions. They analyze things. They're very organized, very detailed. They want things in order. So these are just a snippet of what these temperaments are. There's a book out there called The Spirit-Controlled Temperament by Tim LaHaye. I really suggest a lot of people read that book because it gives you a more in-depth of what these temperaments are. So when Art and Mary came together, Mary had 2 children. And now we're going to hear from them what it was like trying to blend the family with temperament. So Art, would you kind of catch us up now of when you came into this marriage?
Well, when we first got married, my wife is very laid back and not much structure. And I'm very disciplined in everything that I do. Growing up, we had chores at home. So when we got married, kids wanted to sleep in. I got them up, and I said, "You guys got to do, these are the chores you guys got to do." So my wife, all of a sudden, chores, she started crying. She started crying. She goes, "What are you doing to my kids? You're giving them chores. My poor babies, you're going to ruin them." And earlier we talked, I was just doing it in a very hard way that I was basically like a drill instructor, waking them up, rattling the can, waking them up, "Get up, get up, get up." And if they were like, "What's going on? Why are you getting up at 7 in the morning?" And okay, so I'm letting them sleep in till 8 o'clock. And I felt like if you're sleeping in, you're wasting time. The day's going to go by and you're not doing anything. You got to do something productive. And what I realized, yes, they needed structure. Yes, they needed discipline. But it's just the way I was doing it that was hard. I was breaking them down instead of basically instructing them. The Bible basically talks about instructing your kids and loving your kids. I wasn't being loving. I wasn't being loving in a way to show our son, this is the way you got to do things. Mom's not going to be around. And that was my intention. Was my intention good? I believe it was, but it's just the way I was going about it. And I would tell them, your mom and I aren't going to be around forever. So you got to learn to do things at a very young age on your own. As you know, your dad passed away, but your mom took care of you. Your mom and I aren't going to take care of you for the rest of our life. You got to learn to take care of yourself. Was all that true? I believe it is true, but the way I was doing it was wrong.
Do you say that your temperament then was choleric, the strong will, kind of drill sergeant, my way or the highway?
Yeah, yes. And, if I saw him crying, I was like, "Man, come on, suck it up. Why are you crying? Do what you got to do." And I wasn't focused on the tears. And it's not that I was being insensitive. I was trying to instruct them on what was important. And I was being insensitive to their feelings.
So the choleric temperament, tears don't move them.
No.
They have an agenda and they have tenacity. And they're going to get the job done because they've got a job to do. And it's too bad for the tears. Just get the job done. So in your temperament, the choleric temperament, it wasn't what you were saying, because the children needed structure and they needed discipline for their character. But you were too hard in the confrontational part, because to them it was just breaking them instead of building them up.
That's correct. And as soon as my wife would see them crying, she would come in and huddle over them. It's like, what are you doing to my kids? They're crying. And I'm like, step back. I got it. I go, they're just crying. They're being oversensitive. And all of a sudden, they were crying, and the job wouldn't get done. So I would get very upset, because all you got to do is cry, and it's not going to get done. And I told her, look, Mom, if we don't structure them now and show them the things that are important, we're not helping them. We're not helping them in life. And is all that true? I believe it is, but it's just the way I was going about it. And I'm very disciplined. I'm very structured. So as we understood each other's temperaments, we were able to understand how to speak to each other.
Wow, that's huge. So in communication, it's so important that we know each other's temperaments. I know for Reverend Ben and I, we've been married almost 32 years now, and this learning temperaments and love languages, and we're going to talk about love languages later on, but these two things, I believe, really saved my third marriage, because of knowing how to love and how to communicate is so important. And most people pick their opposites. And I think that what happens a lot of times, the choleric doesn't mind confronting, the phlegmatic doesn't like confrontation at all. And then even knowing your children's temperaments is so important, because now I know your children, and both of them have the melancholy temperament, and I believe they even have the phlegmatic temperament. The melancholy temperament gets hurt really easy, just gets destroyed. A lot of times with the choleric parent, the melancholy child can actually have nervous breakdowns, can actually have a lot of mental problems because of the way they were spoken to, the way they were treated, because they don't need that harshness. Words are so important to them. So again, it's not what you say, but how you say it, and knowing the temperament of your spouse and your children can just take your whole relationship to a whole nother level.
Yes, and that's very true. And it came to the point where the kids would just lock themselves up in the room, not want to come out. And what I was doing, not knowing, I was breaking their spirit down. I was breaking their spirit down to where they were just mentally they were disconnecting from the family in a point to where they were driving away. They wouldn't eat with us. They wouldn't sit down with us. They wouldn't communicate with us. And that's what it actually does.
I heard a story one time about a choleric parent, and he took his teenage daughter in for counseling. And he was so mad at this teenage daughter because she would go to her room and never come out. And he had the choleric temperament, the tenacity, and he had determined, and they lived in a state where it snowed in the wintertime, very, very cold. He was determined that he was going to lower his gas bill. So he put the thermostat at like 58 degrees, and he wouldn't let them raise it. He did crazy things on the front door at putting insulation that you would put in a wall. He nailed it to the front door so no cold could come in through any cracks. And he did the same with some windows. And this young girl would just go to her bedroom and stay in her bedroom all day, wouldn't come out. And it turned out in counseling that she had bought herself an electric blanket. And she would just go to her room and stay there because she was so cold. But the father had an agenda. He had an agenda, and he couldn't see that that might have been a little hard for the family, even though, you know, to lower your gas bill is absolutely something that most of us would like to do in the wintertime. But to such a degree, and not care about the feelings of the family or how it sounds to the family or what kind of damage you're doing to the family. And I think what you had mentioned, the kids would go in their room and not want to have anything to do with you, and closing their spirit down. That's so important for us to talk about, because when somebody is giving you a cold shoulder or walking away from you or not wanting to be in your presence, you've done something to shut their spirit man down. And you've been too harsh. And a lot of times people, especially the choleric, they don't know how harsh they sound. Because to them it doesn't sound harsh. Even when they soften up, they think that they're still pretty good. But to other people with different temperaments, that temperament can still sound so harsh and sound like a drill sergeant.
Yes, and my wife would tell me, "You're being too hard on them." And I was like, "No, I'm not." I was focused on what they needed to do, what I told them, not how I said it, not what I said, how I said it. And it came to the point where it was really coming in between us, what was happening with the kids. As we talked earlier in our previous session, you know, we had just bought a home in Duarte, but coming together in our new home, once we were separated, you know, I said, okay, we have a home now, but we're all going to have chores because you guys all have your own bedroom, but we need to have chores. And it's not, okay, you need chores, but how I was saying it, that I was breaking them down. Our son, I was telling him, okay, you got to sweep outside, you got to rake the leaves. But I was waking him up early to do that. And I told him, okay, by a certain time, you need to do this, do this, do this. I was giving him a time schedule to do everything. And eventually, I would go back to him, did this get done? No, I'm going to do it tomorrow. Where if he didn't do it, I was ripping his head off because it didn't get done.
Again, do I believe children need chores? Absolutely. And one of the things that's helped me, and I guess we're talking about children right now and parenting, but is to ask the child, especially as they get older, say something to the effect like, by 5 o'clock this afternoon, I want this done. And you can pick any time between now and 5 o'clock, and amazingly that works a lot of times. But I think that when our children's spirit has been closed down to us, a lot of times it brings rebellion. It brings depression, it brings anger, it brings resentment, it brings unforgiveness. And so we don't even know what's going on in our children's emotions or their soul realm and how the enemy is really working on them. I even believe it can bring a spirit of murder because there's so much hurt and pain that goes on, especially in a melancholy where they're quiet, they want to conform, but when they've been so wounded, they can really dig their heels in and not give you what you want, just out of rebellion. And so I really think sometimes that the choleric temperament being too hard in a situation can bring rebellion and anger and even a lot of times mental illness, depending on how much that choleric has broken that child down. You had talked about your father, and it sounds like your father was pretty strong-willed.
He was very strong-willed, But my mom was the disciplinary.
Ah.
She would actually give us chores to do. And I'll be honest with you, I was always the lazy one. I was always the lazy one. My brother was always helping me out to get it done. I would get tired and I would sit back. But eventually, at a very young age, I started working. And it wasn't my mom that taught me the discipline. It was the first guy that I worked for that taught me the discipline, because I started sweeping a parking lot, and if I didn't do it right, he would make me do it over again. And it came to the point where if I didn't do it right, he wouldn't pay me. And I felt terrible. And he would yell at me, and he was actually in the Army, and he would talk to me as I was in the Army, and he would start yelling at me. And eventually, that taught me the discipline. Then he brought me back it was a Mexican fast food place. Then when I got a little older, he would put me to wash pots and pans at 14 years old. So when I started washing pots and pans, if I didn't wash the pots and pans right, he would make me do all of them all over again. And I was like, this guy's terrible. How could he even be in business? But what I learned, it was the discipline, but I also learned the way he was talking to people. Later on in life, as I got a little older, his communication, the way he was talking to people feared him because the way he would talk to them. They didn't want to get close to him. He had really no relationship with. He had the business skills, but he had no communication with his employees. It was his wife that had the communication.
So how did you learn how to parent then? From your mom, your dad, or this man that you thought he taught you how to do things right? So was that ever in the back of your mind when you were now becoming a parent?
It was, the discipline part was in the back of my mind. My wife, when we got married, she said, you've always been disciplined. You've always been structured. And I laughed at her because when growing up, I couldn't balance a checkbook. I couldn't hold a job. I had no structure. So she asked my sister, has your brother always been this way? And she said, no, he's never been disciplined. You guys are all disciplined, she said. No, but Art wasn't disciplined. So the fact that I started working at the Mexican place, it really taught me structure. And I had it in the back of my head, I want our kids to have structure in their life. But I believe, since I didn't have a relationship with my dad, I didn't have parenting skills. I didn't know how to be a father. So my dad wasn't loving. My mom was very hard. She was hard, but if you were crying, she would say, oh, don't be a sissy. Why are you crying? Only girls cry. So men don't cry.
Wow.
And I always heard that growing up. And so if you were crying, I had to suck it up so I wouldn't cry. So when my son was crying because something I told him, and I would tell him, suck it up, princess, don't be crying. Why are you crying? Because of what I'm telling you. Focus on what I'm telling you instead of how I'm saying it. But I really believe that as God started healing our marriage, not only did he heal our marriage, but he taught me how to be a better father.
Amen.
He taught me he taught me how to love my kids unconditionally. Because when I married my wife, I told her, when I marry you, I'm marrying your kids. And whether they call me father or they don't call me father, I'm okay with it, but I'm still their father. And I believe that as God started healing our marriage, He taught me how to be a better husband, how to be a better father, how to love my daughter unconditionally. We have an amazing grandson that drives me nuts, that just doesn't stop. And I'm so grateful every day that God healed our marriage, that I'm able to see our grandson.
Amen. I find a lot of times in marriage that if we're not healed from our past and we don't have love, we can't give love. And many times we parent the way we were parented. We have a husband or a wife the way our parents demonstrated that to us. So what we find that as God started healing Art and Mary, He started teaching them new ways to have relationship. And it's so exciting today to see them thriving, to see them being a grandparent and having their marriage so blessed. So till next time, we're going to have Art and Mary back in studio. We're going to continue to talk about blended families, temperaments, and love languages as in our next episodes. You don't want to miss it. Shalom.
Introducing the new Zulon Press book, The Bride of Christ Without Spot or Wrinkle by Dr. Patricia Venegas. The Bride of Christ Without Spot or Wrinkle is available at Christian bookstores and online. Purchase it today.